I want to talk to you about something that's been on my mind since I read a remarkable piece of analysis that came out of South Africa last week. It's about podcasting, but it's really about something bigger, about how we build creative economies in Africa, about who captures the values that African creators generate, and about what happens when an entire industry realizes it's been flying blind. A few days ago, South Africa's parliament held a roundtable on podcasting regulation. Podcasters, platform executives from Meta, TikTok, and Google, regulators, broadcasters, lawmakers, they all showed up. And something unexpected happened. But before I tell you what that was, let me read you one sentence that stopped me in my tracks. And this is from Hendrik Bird, a PhD candidate who watched the whole thing and wrote about it afterwards. He says, and I quote, "South Africa is home to one of the most vibrant, culturally rich, and economically promising podcasting sectors on the continent, and almost nobody can prove it." End of quote. When I read that, I thought immediately of Nigeria. So today, I want to take you through what happened in that parliamentary room in South Africa, what it reveals about the structural conditions African podcasters are operating under, and what it means for those of us creating audio content in Nigeria and across the continent. Because if South Africa, which is ahead of us in many ways, is flying blind, then we need to talk about what that means for the rest of us.
This is Into the Podverse with Tony Doe. Podcast innovations, challenges, opportunities, and culture from an African perspective.
Before we continue, a quick word about something I'm building, the Nigerian Podcast Index, or NPI. It's a public, independent directory created to document Nigerian podcasts, not rank them, not review them, just to make them discoverable and preserved. Too many Nigerian podcasts disappear quietly. The NPI exists so our work doesn't disappear with them. One important thing is that your podcast needs an RSS feed. An RSS feed is what makes your podcast a podcast. It's the open pipeline that allows your show to appear across platforms. Without it, your content is locked inside one app and platforms change. With an RSS feed, you own your distribution. Your episodes can travel, be archived, and still be found years from now. If you host a podcast produced in Nigeria or by a Nigerian anywhere in the world, and you have a working RSS feed, I'd love for you to submit it. It's simple, free, and manually verified. Submit your podcast at bit.ly/submityourpodcastng. Now back to the episode. So what actually happened in South Africa? On March 24, 2026, the Portfolio Committee on Communications and Digital Technologies convened this roundtable. And according to both Jonathan Vanker, he's the managing director of South African Podcasters Guild, and I'd like to think of him as a good friend, and Hendrik Bird's detailed analysis, people walked into that room ready for a fight. The chairperson actually described it as people arriving with their daggers out. Everyone had their positions locked in. The podcasters were worried about regulation crushing creativity. The broadcasters wanted level playing fields. The platforms had their talking points ready. The regulators had their mandates. It could have been a disaster. But by the end of the session, we're talking mid-morning to early evening, multiple panels, breakaway groups, the whole thing. The same chairperson said she ended up mostly proud to be South African. That's not something you hear at the end of most government meetings about media regulation. So what changed? Here's what Hendrik observed, and I'm quoting here. "The most important moment of the day came not from a platform representative or a regulator, but from the rapporteur of one of the breakaway groups who put it plainly, we do not have enough research, we do not have enough data points, and we do not really understand this environment." End of quote. The committee chair echoed it. A committee member raised it again. The Director General of the Department of Communications acknowledged it. And suddenly, everyone in that room, the people who came with their daggers out, realized they were arguing about something none of them could actually measure. Let me say that again because it's important. They were arguing about regulating an industry that nobody in that room could prove basic facts about. So what don't they know? Well, South Africa doesn't have reliable, independently verified data on how many active podcasters there are, where they are located, what they are earning, how many are generating meaningful income versus subsidizing their creative work for other sources, geographic distribution of audiences, which monetization models are working, for whom, and under what conditions. Now, before we get too comfortable feeling superior about this, let me ask, do we know these things about Nigerian podcasting? We have the Nigerian Podcast Index. Yay! And look, that's great. It's an admirable effort at creating visibility. I worked hard. But let's be honest about what it actually is. It's a catalog. It's not a census. It tells us which shows have registered or been discovered. It doesn't exactly tell us how many Nigerians are actually creating podcasts. It doesn't tell us what percentage are generating income sufficient to sustain production. It doesn't tell us how much advertising revenue generated from Nigerian podcast audiences actually reaches Nigerian creators versus being absorbed by platform-level buys where the money goes to Google or Spotify and the creator gets exposure. We have anecdotes. We have the shows that trend on Twitter. We have the visible success stories. What we don't have is systematic, independently verified evidence of the economic structure underlying Nigerian podcasting. And here's why that matters more than we think. Hendrik Bird's analysis identified 3 fault lines that the South African roundtable surfaced but couldn't solve. And when I read through them, I realized all 3 apply directly to Nigeria. First, platform power and value distribution. Platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Audiomack, whatever you're using, they're where we distribute content and where audiences discover us. It makes sense, right? But platforms also control the advertising infrastructure. They control the payment rails. They control algorithmic discovery. They control listener data. And here's the question South Africa couldn't get answered. How much advertising revenue is generated from South African podcast audiences? What percentage of that actually reaches creators? What portion leaves the country entirely and goes to shareholders in, say, California? Now, replace South African with Nigerian and tell me if you know the answer. Right. Nigerian creators generate attention. That attention has commercial value. Advertisers pay for it, but most of us have no idea whether we're capturing 5%, 15%, or 40% of the value we're generating. Jonathan Vanker put it plainly, and this number shocked me. He said he could count on roughly 2 hands. I mean, he only has 2 hands. The number of South African podcasters declaring podcast income on their tax returns. 2 hands. In South Africa, which has a more developed podcasting sector than Nigeria. In Nigeria, I guess the number is similar or lower. The number is non-existent. What are we saying? And it's not because podcasters are evading tax. It's because most are not earning enough to declare. Second, self-regulation and its limits. South Africa's roundtable participants broadly supported self-regulation. The idea was that if we built on the South African Podcasters Guild's existing voluntary pledge, create measurable standards, and give advertisers confidence so they can invest directly in creators rather than just buying platform-level ads, then things will be okay. Sounds good, right? But here's the problem. Nigeria doesn't have an equivalent to the South African Podcasters Guild yet. We don't have a central professional body representing podcasters' collective interests yet. We don't have a voluntary code yet. We don't have a mechanism for industry self-governance yet. The closest we have are informal networks, WhatsApp groups, and the occasional conference or awards ceremony. But even if we built one tomorrow, South Africa's National Association of Broadcasters made a critical point. Self-regulation works for willing participants, but it doesn't reach bad actors. It doesn't address AI-generated podcasts with no identifiable human creator. It doesn't handle cross-border jurisdiction issues when a podcaster is Nigerian, but their hosting platform is American and their audience is Pan-African. What Nigeria needs isn't just self-regulation. We need credible infrastructure for self-regulation that can eventually interface with formal regulatory frameworks when needed without stifling the sector in the process. Third, local creativity versus global infrastructure. We're creating within an infrastructure we didn't build, governed by terms we didn't negotiate, measured by metrics we didn't set, and paid through systems that may not even be accessible to us depending on our country and banking setup. Hendrik Bird has a name for this condition. He calls it adverse digital incorporation. You're on the platform, you're participating, you're generating value, but the structure of the system ensures that you capture a disproportionately small share of the value you create. For Nigerian podcasters, this plays out in very tangible ways. Advertising revenue that requires US bank accounts or payment thresholds most of us never reach. Algorithmic recommendation systems that favor established shows in established markets, read not Nigeria. Sponsorship marketplaces that prioritize English language content for US and UK audiences. Analytics dashboards that show you listener numbers but not listener value. You produce the culture, you build the audience, someone else extracts the rent. Now, Hendrik is doing something about this. He's conducting doctoral research on podcast monetization among South African Podcasters Guild members. His study will produce empirical answers to questions like how are creators actually monetizing, where does value leak despite their efforts to capture it, how does structural position within the platform ecosystem shape what monetization options are available. Nigeria needs the same research. Not because we want to copy South Africa's findings, but because structural conditions differ. Think about it. South Africa has a stronger formal advertising market with established agency relationships. They have more legacy media infrastructure that podcasters can leverage. They have geographic concentration in major metros that makes in-person networking easier. And they have a government that, whatever its motivations, is at least convening stakeholders to discuss the sector. Nigeria has a larger population and diaspora, creating theoretically bigger audiences. We have more linguistic and cultural diversity, which fragments audiences but also creates micro markets. We have weaker formal advertising infrastructure, but stronger direct-to-consumer and SME advertising culture. And we have virtually no policy attention to podcasting as a sector. Might be a blessing in disguise. These differences matter. They matter for which monetization strategies work. They matter for which forms of collective organization are viable. They matter for which policy interventions would be helpful versus harmful. But without systematic research, we're just arguing from anecdote and assumption. Despite all the knowledge gaps, South Africa's roundtable produced something valuable, a shared acknowledgement that the sector matters and deserves support. Here's what they committed to: a formal parliamentary report within 2 months, becoming a citable public document. Continued participation from platforms alongside creators and regulators. Future roundtables co-hosted by their communications regulator and the department. Recognition of the South African Podcasters Guild's voluntary pledge as the foundation for a self-regulatory framework. And this one is critical. An explicit recommendation that corporate digital media budgets earmark a minimum proportion for direct spend with podcast creators, not platform-level buys above the content, but money that actually reaches the producers themselves. That last one is huge. It is the creative economy equivalent of localization requirements, ensuring that money spent on South African podcast audiences actually reaches South African podcast producers. Nigeria could do this. We have the companies. We have the advertisers. We have the creators. What we don't have is a collective body representing podcasters, a convening space where stakeholders can meet on equal footing. Policy attention from communications regulators, industry-wide data that would make the case for why this matters economically. Jonathan Vanker used a metaphor that I can't stop thinking about. He said, And I quote, "The podcasting industry is like a daisy breaking out of the concrete. We're coming through, we're growing, we're inevitable. But we'd turn into a garden a lot faster if someone cleared the concrete and poured a little water on us." End of quote. Nigerian podcasting is breaking through too. I see it in the shows that chart on Spotify Nigeria. I see it in the branded content deals. I see it in the conferences and the WhatsApp groups and the late night editing sessions. But we're still breaking through concrete. The concrete is platform opacity, lack of collective bargaining power, absence of industry standards, no systematic data to prove our economic contribution, policy neglect. So what would pouring water look like? Short term, form a Nigerian Podcasters Guild or Association, or federate the existing informal networks. Conduct a census of active podcasters, where they are, what they're earning, what they need. Create a voluntary code of conduct. Build case studies showing Nigerian brands that invested directly in podcast creators and saw ROI. Medium term, engage the National Broadcasting Commission, Nigerian Communications Commission, the Federal Ministry of Information, not for regulation, for dialogue. Push Nigerian brands and agencies to commit to direct creator spend. Develop shared infrastructure like legal templates, rate cards, production standards. Build bridges to legacy media where it makes sense. And long term, commission or support academic research on Nigerian podcast economics. Advocate for policy frameworks that protect creators without stifling innovation. Build Pan-African networks with other national podcasting associations. Work towards data sovereignty, African-owned podcast hosting, analytics and monetization infrastructure where economically viable. South Africa's podcasting sector is more developed than Nigeria's in almost every measurable way, and they still can't prove basic facts about their own industry. If they're flying blind, we're flying blind with the instruments covered. And yet, both countries are producing extraordinary audio, cultural work that matters, storytelling that resonates, journalism that fills gaps legacy media can't or won't, education and entertainment that reaches people where they are. The tragedy isn't that platforms exist or that monetization is hard. The tragedy is that we're building something valuable and we can't measure its value. We can't capture a fair share of it and can't make the case for structural support because we lack the evidence. South Africa just named this problem in front of Parliament. They haven't solved it yet, but they've made it visible. Nigeria needs to do the same. So here's where I land. If you're a Nigerian podcaster listening to this and you think a Nigerian Podcasters Association or Guild would be worth building, let's start that conversation. If you're a researcher interested in studying Nigerian podcast economics, I'll connect you with people who have the data access and industry relationships to make it possible. If you're a brand or agency willing to commit to direct creator spend, I want to feature you as a case study. And if you're a podcaster anywhere else on the continent, Kenya, Ghana, Uganda, Ethiopia, Egypt, wherever, and this resonates with you, share it. Let's compare notes. Let's understand which problems are universal and which are context specific. Because the daisy is breaking through. It's time to clear some concrete. I hope today's episode sparked some ideas, tackled a challenge, or opened your eyes to a new opportunity. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Your support helps keep this conversation going. And if you've got thoughts or stories of your own, then please reach out to me at Tony Doe Media on social media. I'd love to hear them. Until next time, keep innovating, growing, and chasing those opportunities. Chat again soon.